I still remember the day Clara and Ethan came over as if it was just yesterday. It wasn't a special event or anything. It was just a simple get-together with old friends. I assumed it would be just like any other visit. We'd have a few drinks, share some laughs, tell a few stories, and then everyone would head back to their own lives. But in hindsight, I now see that night marked the beginning of everything falling apart. I didn't know it at the time. Isabella, my wife, was already in full hostess mode, darting around the kitchen like she was preparing a feast for royalty. Grilled salmon, arugula salad with pine nuts. She really went all out. She wore this dress that clung to her in just the right way, reminding me of why I married her in the first place. It wasn't the kind of outfit she would wear just for anyone. It felt intentional, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It bugged me, but I kept my mouth shut. I'd gotten home early to make sure everything was set. I tidied up, made the guest bed, even lit some candles on the dining table, trying to create the perfect atmosphere. I wanted everything to go smoothly, thinking that hosting Clara and Ethan would give me a sense of calm. Turns out, I couldn't have been more wrong. The second they pulled up, Isabella was already at the door, practically leaping out of the house before I could even wipe my hands on a dish towel. She rushed over to Clara with a big hug, and then when she greeted Ethan, their hug lingered just a beat too long. You know the kind I mean, right? It's that hug where it's not exactly flirty, but it's a little too warm to be completely innocent. Ethan handed me a bottle of whiskey, the fancy kind. A little token of appreciation for having them over, he said, grinning that charming grin of his. Everyone laughed like it was a scene from a sitcom. I took the bottle, smiled back, but deep down, I felt a growing discomfort as we carried their bags to the guest room. Isabella casually touched Ethan's arm as they chatted about nothing in particular. She was laughing way too much. Ethan, of course, was lapping it up. I noticed it, but I tried to convince myself it didn't mean anything. I mean, Ethan had always been one of those guys, smooth and charming, the kind who treats every woman like she's the only one in the room, even if she's married. Still, he gave me a nod, and I figured it was harmless. An hour later, Ryan and Sophia, our neighbors, showed up. Ryan's a big guy with a past that sounds like it came straight out of a movie. Ex-sailor turned security guard, always making jokes like the world's his playground. Sophia's a nice woman, into health food and all that, running an Instagram account that Isabella follows. They've been over so many times that it usually feels like family. The wine started flowing, and for a while, things felt normal. Ryan cracked jokes about work, Sophia rambled on about some new smoothie recipe, and Ethan played along with his usual charm. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling between Isabella and Ethan. I wasn't trying to find trouble, but trouble had definitely found me. Dinner was when it really started to feel off. Isabella kept laughing at Ethan's jokes, even the ones that weren't funny. And every time she refilled his wine glass, her hand would rest on his wrist just a little too long. Ethan didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into it, locking eyes with her in a way that made me feel sick. I tried to focus on the conversation, but with each sip of wine, my unease grew. It felt like they were in their own little world, and I was just a bystander who had somehow been excluded. It wasn't just small talk. Ethan wasn't looking at my wife like he was just chatting with her. No, he was looking at her as if they shared some kind of unspoken connection, something I wasn't part of. And Isabella? She was looking back at him with this spark in her eye, a kind of excitement I hadn't seen in her in ages. It hit me hard because I couldn't remember the last time she looked at me like that. After dinner, Ryan nudged me. Come on, let's step outside for a smoke. We slipped out to the back porch while the others stayed inside. I was thankful for the chance to get away from the growing tension. Ryan lit up a cigar and took a long drag before glancing at me sideways. You notice anything off tonight? I shrugged, trying to play it cool. Off how? Ryan leaned against the railing, exhaling a thick cloud of smoke. Ethan's a little too friendly with your wife, don't you think? His words hit me like a slap. I'd been telling myself I was imagining things, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. I wanted to brush it off, tell myself it was nothing, but Ryan wasn't letting it go. Look, I've been around long enough to spot these things. A guy like Ethan? He's trouble. And Isabella? Well, she's not exactly pushing him away, is she? I could feel my jaw clench, but I forced a smile. "You're just overthinking it," I said, though deep down, I knew he wasn't. Ryan gave me a knowing look, like he'd seen it all before. "Just keep an eye on it," he said, tapping his cigar in the ashtray. "Better safe than sorry." As we stood there in silence, his words settled over me, heavy and suffocating. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but I didn't want to admit it, not yet. By the time we went back inside, the night was winding down. Isabella was sitting on the couch next to Ethan. Their bodies were angled toward each other, like they were in their own little world. She gave me a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Clara, on the other hand, was oblivious. Or maybe she just didn't want to see it. She was curled up in the armchair, scrolling through her phone, completely checked out from the evening. I sat down across from them, nursing the whiskey Ethan had given me, watching them like a hawk. Isabella laughed again. Ethan whispered something in her ear, and her hand brushed against his knee. That's when I knew something was wrong, and it wasn't going to end well. I just didn't know how bad it would get yet. Lying next to Isabella that night, I couldn't fall asleep. Every time she shifted or murmured in her sleep, my mind was racing. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew the cracks in our marriage had been there for a long time. Ethan wasn't the cause of our problems. He just brought everything to the surface. And once things started unraveling, I knew there would be no stopping it. In the days that followed, I began noticing things I'd ignored before. Or maybe I had noticed them and just didn't want to face the truth. Isabella and Ethan were always together, like magnets pulling them toward each other. No matter what was happening, if I walked into a room, there they were, laughing or leaning close over something, like no one else was even in the room. Each time I saw them like that, my stomach churned. At first, it was small things, little moments that I could have easily brushed off if I had wanted to. But the more I saw, the harder it became to ignore. One afternoon, I came in from the back porch, hoping to catch Isabella off guard. I hadn't made a sound, but when I turned the corner, there they were, standing so close that it looked like Ethan was about to kiss her. He was leaning in, whispering something in her ear, and Isabella had this look on her face, this guilty expression, like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. The moment she saw me, she quickly pulled away. But it was too late. My blood went cold, but I forced myself to keep a neutral face. I wasn't ready to let on that I knew. Not yet, anyway. It got to the point where I couldn't keep my suspicions to myself anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. So, I did the only thing that seemed logical. I pulled Clara aside one night when Ethan wasn't around. "Hey, Clara," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice caught in my throat. "Have you noticed anything weird between Ethan and Isabella?" She looked at me like I just asked her if I had two heads. "What do you mean?" "Ethan's always friendly. That's just who he is." I almost dropped it right there. Maybe she was right. Maybe Ethan was just one of those guys who didn't realize the lines he was crossing. But then, after a long pause, she frowned. "Actually," she said, rubbing the back of her neck like she was debating whether or not to say something, "I did see him put his hand on Isabella's back the other day. It wasn't just a friendly pat either. It was different, and she didn't exactly push him off." I nodded, feeling the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. That was exactly what I had been sensing. "That's what I've been saying," I replied, my voice low. "Something's off." Clara sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was going. "Look, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but yeah, it does feel a little off. We made a pact right then and there to keep an eye on them without tipping them off. I hated dragging Clara into this mess, but I needed someone else to see what I was seeing, to confirm that I wasn't just losing my mind. She agreed to help, though I could tell it wasn't something she was eager to do. Neither of us really knew what we might uncover, but we had to find out. The first chance we got, Clara and I decided to catch them off guard. We figured if anything was really going on, we just had to show up at the right moment, unannounced. So, one afternoon, we made up an excuse to leave the house during lunch, acting like we'd be gone for a couple of hours. Halfway through, we turned the car around and came back, hoping to walk in on them. My heart was pounding the entire way. Clara kept glancing at me, probably just as nervous as I was. When we walked through the front door, the house was eerily quiet. Clara followed me, both of us walking on tiptoe toward the kitchen. But when we turned the corner, we didn't find what we expected. Instead, Isabella and Ethan were standing at the stove, chopping vegetables together. They weren't even standing that close, side by side, just talking and laughing like everything was normal. For a moment, I felt like an idiot. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I'd imagined everything. But the feeling didn't go away. Something still felt wrong, like there was more going on beneath the surface than I could see. I could tell Clara felt the same. As we stood there, watching them laugh and cook together, she leaned in and whispered, "Maybe we just didn't come at the right moment." Her words stuck with me long after that. What if we had missed it? What if whatever was going on only happened when no one was around to see it? That thought kept me up all night, staring at the ceiling while Isabella slept soundly beside me, like she didn't have a care in the world. Every laugh, every glance, every touch between them. It was all starting to feel like the tip of an iceberg, and I had no idea how deep it went. The worst part was, I still didn't have any real proof. I was stuck in limbo, somewhere between suspicion and paranoia, and it was driving me crazy. I kept telling myself I had to stay calm, that I had to wait for the right moment to confront them. But with each passing day, the doubts dug deeper, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something would break. And when it did, there would be no turning back. One morning, over coffee, Clara mentioned Liam. Her voice was low, like saying his name was some kind of secret. "He's a tech guy," she said. "He could probably help us figure this out." No questions asked. That night, we reached out to him. Liam didn't press for details, which was a relief. He showed up with a duffel bag full of gadgets that looked like something out of a spy movie. Tiny cameras, no bigger than buttons, with crystal-clear resolution. "Where do you want them?" he asked, grinning like he'd just been recruited for an undercover mission. We set up cameras in the kitchen, the living room, and the guest room, places where Ethan and Isabella spent the most time together. I configured the system myself, making sure the feeds were live on my laptop. I needed to be able to check them at any time, from anywhere. As we finished, Liam slapped me on the back. "Good luck, man. Hope you don't find what you're looking for." I didn't respond. I knew in my gut that luck wasn't on my side. The next 2 days were pure torture. Every spare moment, I had my laptop open, eyes glued to the screen, watching hours of footage. But there was nothing. Ethan and Isabella acted like everything was normal, or at least, as normal as two people who were secretly crossing boundaries could act. They cooked, they talked, but nothing even remotely suspicious happened. By the second day, my nerves were shredded. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I was just imagining things. By the third day, I started to question myself. Had I really reached the point where I was spying on my own wife? Was I truly paranoid? Or was there something actually happening? Clara tried to comfort me when she saw how deeply I was spiraling, but her words felt distant, like static in the background. "We'll figure this out," she said. But even those words didn't do much to settle the growing storm inside me. That afternoon, while both Clara and I were at work, my phone buzzed. It was a motion alert from one of the cameras. My heart dropped as I scrambled to open the live feed from the living room. There they were, Ethan and Isabella, standing impossibly close to each other. Their faces were almost touching. It started with a kiss, tentative at first, but it quickly deepened. Isabella reached up and pulled Ethan in closer, and in that moment, everything I had been trying to ignore was suddenly in front of me. I sat frozen, my stomach in knots, watching the scene unfold as rage and disbelief swirled together inside me. This wasn't just a kiss. This was raw, unfiltered passion. Within moments, they were practically undressing each other, tumbling onto the couch in a heap of tangled limbs. It was reckless, like they couldn't stop themselves, like they were a pair of teenagers sneaking around without a care in the world. And then they laughed, like it was some kind of private joke. Dirty, carefree laughs between heated kisses, as if everything about this betrayal was just a silly, secret game. The fury inside me burned hotter than I ever imagined it could. Clara had come over to the laptop by this point. She saw what I was watching, her face draining of color as she pressed her hand over her mouth. But it did nothing to hide the devastation on her face. "Look at them," I muttered through gritted teeth. my voice barely a whisper, but venom dripped from every word. Clara didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. It was all in front of us now. The doubts, the gut feelings, the unspoken tension. It was all confirmed in the most disgusting, undeniable way. The video ended with them sprawled out on the couch, grinning like nothing mattered, completely unaware that they had been caught. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling with rage. My mind raced, already piecing together what I would do next. But I wasn't just angry, I was shattered. It was as if someone had ripped out everything I thought I knew, and now it was just ashes. There was no going back from this. Clara sat beside me, silent and pale, her fists clenched at her sides. "So now what?" she asked softly. I didn't know. But one thing was clear. This was far from over. Clara and I arranged to meet up at a hotel later that night. We didn't have to say it, but we both understood that this wasn't just about confronting them. It was about processing what we had just witnessed and trying to make sense of the wreckage that had become our lives. I booked a place on the edge of town, a small, quiet hotel where no one would recognize us. It had a cozy feel to it, with a jacuzzi and a king-sized bed. I made the reservation with a half-hearted joke. At least we'll have somewhere comfortable to sit and plan. Clara let out a small laugh, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. We both knew that this night wasn't about planning revenge. It was about something deeper, something we hadn't fully acknowledged yet. When we arrived, the air between us was thick, the tension almost suffocating. We opened a bottle of wine and sat across from each other on the edge of the bed. At first, we stuck to safe topics: work, family, old friends, dipping our toes in the water without diving too deep. But after the second bottle, the truth started pouring out. Clara broke first, a bitter laugh escaping her. "Ethan's been doing this for years," she said, shaking her head as if she had to convince herself of it. "It's not even about Isabella. He's always been this way. Every time I thought maybe it would change, it never did." She wasn't venting anymore. She was unraveling. Years of hurt and frustration spilling out all at once. I sat and listened, seeing her not as the calm, collected woman she always presented to the world, but as someone deeply broken, someone who had been holding it all in for too long. "Honestly," I said, swirling the last of my wine, "my marriage has been dead for a while. We're not even a couple anymore. We're just two people sharing space." I let my words sit in the air for a moment. I guess Isabella was just waiting for the excuse to move on. It felt strange to speak that truth aloud, to admit how empty everything had become, but it also felt freeing in a way I hadn't expected. We sat there in the silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Our hands brushed a couple of times, accidental at first, but then it felt less like an accident and more like it was meant to happen. I looked at her, and for a moment, I saw a flicker in her eyes, something that mirrored exactly what I was feeling. Why not? I thought. What do we have left to lose? Without thinking, I kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't slow. It was desperate, raw, driven by emotions neither of us knew how to control. Clothes hit the floor faster than I could process. It was chaotic, reckless, and neither of us tried to stop it. I grabbed her by the waist and pulled her onto the bed, like it was our last chance to feel something real. We didn't hold back. Not for a second. This wasn't just about the physical act. It was an escape from everything we had been suffocating under. Betrayal, disappointment, pain. Each kiss, each touch was a way to shut out the noise of our lives, even if only for a moment. When it was over, we lay there, bodies slick with sweat, hearts pounding. For a while, neither of us said anything. We just stared at the ceiling, lost in the weight of what had just happened. Clara was the first to get up. She didn't say a word, just slipped off the bed and walked to the bathroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The guilt hit me like a truck. I had never felt anything as intense as what had just transpired between us. And yet, at the same time, I felt like I'd crossed a line I could never come back from. I sat up, running my hands through my hair, trying to piece together what we had just done. What the hell was that? And why did it feel like the most real thing I had experienced in years? The shower ran for what felt like an eternity. When Clara finally came back out, wrapped in a towel, she didn't look at me. She just sat at the edge of the bed, her face blank, like she was already somewhere else. I wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. But the words never came because the truth was, I wasn't sorry. And deep down, I didn't think Clara was either. We had both been shattered by the people we trusted the most, and in that moment, the only thing that made sense was each other. Even if it was temporary, even if it was wrong. Clara gave me a small, weary smile before lying down on the far side of the bed, as far away from me as she could without falling off. I watched her, the silence between us heavy, until her breathing slowed and she drifted off to sleep. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, fully aware that nothing would ever be the same again, between us or anyone. The next morning, I drove home with a single thought pounding in my head. My marriage was over. There was no fixing this. There was no point in talking through it anymore. I was done. When I walked in, Isabella was sitting at the dining table, casually scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. It made my stomach turn. How easy it was for her to act like everything was fine, like nothing had changed. I didn't say a word. I just dropped the laptop on the table and opened the video. The footage from the living room played, every second of it laid bare. The sound of their laughter filled the room, making my skin crawl. Isabella's face went white as she stared at the screen, her eyes wide with shock. But instead of guilt or remorse, the first thing that came out of her mouth was venom. "You drove me to this. You were always cold," she snapped, slamming the laptop shut like it would somehow erase what had just played out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you kidding me?" I shot back, my voice sharp, slicing through the air. "You cheated on me, Isabella. You slept with Ethan in our house. Don't you dare try to blame me." She stood up, her face contorting with anger. "You think I wanted this? You think I planned it?" She almost spat the words out. "You've been emotionally checked out for months, Daniel. What was I supposed to do?" It was like she was trying to rewrite everything, twisting it to make herself the victim. But I wasn't having any of it. "You could have talked to me. You could have done anything but screw our friend," I yelled, my frustration bubbling over. "It was a one-time thing," she shouted, her hands flying up in exasperation. "It didn't mean anything." Her words stung like acid. "So that makes it okay? That makes everything fine?" I shook my head, disgusted. "No. This is over, Isabella. Pack your things and get out." I saw it in her eyes the moment she realized there was no turning back. She lunged at me, her nails digging into my arm, but I stepped back, refusing to let it escalate. "You're not throwing me out of my own house," I said firmly, my voice cold. She screamed, but the desperation in her voice betrayed her. I stayed distant, unmoving. "We're done," I repeated. "You need to leave. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here." Meanwhile, Clara had her own confrontation with Ethan. I didn't hear all the details until later, but I could imagine it. Ethan tried to talk his way out of it, claiming it wasn't what it seemed, that it was just a stupid mistake. But Clara wasn't buying it. "You didn't just betray me, Ethan," she told him, her voice steady but full of fury. "You destroyed any respect I had left for you." Ethan begged, tried to reason with her, but Clara didn't budge. Without hesitation, she kicked him out of their house, slamming the door behind him. There was no forgiveness, no room for reconciliation. We were both done, Isabella and me, and Clara and Ethan. A couple of weeks passed, and I tried to rebuild whatever was left of my life. But the pieces didn't seem to fit. Just when I thought I was starting to make sense of everything, I got a call from Clara. I could tell from the way she hesitated that something was wrong. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And it's probably yours." The words hit me like a freight train. I sat there, stunned, trying to comprehend what she had just said. We had been reckless that night at the hotel, too caught up in our own mess to think about the consequences. Clara explained that she and Ethan had always used protection, but we hadn't. My mind raced, trying to process what this meant. I wasn't ready to be a father, not like this. Not under these circumstances. The thought of bringing a child into this mess made me feel empty inside. "I've been thinking about an abortion," Clara said carefully, her voice uncertain. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was drowning, dragged down by the weight of everything that had happened. Part of me wanted to say it wasn't my problem, that I didn't ask for any of this. But I knew deep down that wasn't true. This was my mess just as much as it was hers. And no matter how hard I tried to avoid it, there was no escaping what we had done. I stayed silent for a moment, the gravity of the situation pressing down on me. "Yeah," I whispered. "We need to figure this out." And just like that, everything changed again. The waiting room at the clinic felt suffocating, even though no one spoke a word. The pale walls, the stiff chairs, the sterile smell. It was all too much. Clara sat beside me, her eyes fixed straight ahead like she was already somewhere else, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She hadn't said a word since we walked in. I kept shifting in my seat, trying to find some kind of comfort, but it was impossible. The silence between us felt suffocating, as if the air itself was thick with everything unsaid, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. When the nurse called us back, my stomach turned in on itself. Clara and I walked in silence down the sterile hallway, following her into a small consultation room. The doctor's greeting was calm, measured, too calm, as if he had already seen this kind of thing 1,000 times and knew exactly how it would go. He began explaining the procedure with the precision of someone who delivers bad news regularly. What would happen, the risks involved, what Clara would experience physically and emotionally after. I heard the words, but they barely registered, like a distant echo that didn't quite make it through the fog in my mind. Clara didn't say much, just nodded occasionally, her expression completely neutral. I couldn't tell if she was holding it together, or if the weight of it all had already numbed her. I wanted to say something, anything, to make her feel better, but the truth was, there was nothing I could say that would change anything. We had made the decision long before we even stepped into the clinic. There was no question about whether it was the right choice. Bringing a child into the mess we had created wasn't an option for either of us. It didn't make it any easier to accept, but at least it made things clearer. When we left the clinic, the silence between us was more oppressive than before. We walked to the car, and I climbed in, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding me together. Clara sat next to me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The weight of what had just happened settled in like a storm cloud, neither of us knowing how to break the silence. Eventually, Clara let out a breath, long and heavy, like she had been holding it in for hours. "We never talk about this again," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. "Yeah, never." She gave me a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think I need to leave the city," she said quietly, as if admitting something she had kept locked away. "I can't stay here. I need to start fresh." "I get it," I said, the words coming easier than I expected. And I did understand. Staying here wasn't an option for me either. This place, these memories, they were all tainted. We both needed to escape the wreckage we'd created and try to start over somewhere far from here. Clara reached over and squeezed my hand before getting out of the car. I watched her walk away, the distance between us growing with each step, and for the first time, it felt like the last chapter of a story had been written. There was nothing left to say after that. In the weeks that followed, I packed up my things and left. I didn't make a big deal out of it. No goodbyes, no farewell speeches. I just needed to get away from everything. The memories, the people, and the version of myself I didn't recognize anymore. I found a small apartment in a different city. Nothing special, but it was mine. A place where I could stop being the guy whose life had fallen apart, whose wife had betrayed him. I found work in a local office. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a routine, something to keep my mind busy. I started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done in years. I picked up old hobbies, things I had abandoned over the years. Reading, hiking, sketching, even though I wasn't great at it. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like I was starting to rebuild my life from the pieces that were left. Then one afternoon, out of nowhere, I got a call from Sophia. It was strange, hearing her voice again after everything that had happened. "Hey, Daniel," she said, her voice hesitant. "Do you want to grab coffee sometime?" I agreed without hesitation. The thought of meeting her felt like a breath of fresh air, something that could clear away the dust of everything I'd been carrying. When we sat down at the cafe, it felt easy, like nothing had ever happened. She told me about her divorce from Ryan, how their marriage had fallen apart, piece by piece. We weren't happy, she admitted, her eyes focused on her coffee. We just kept going through the motions, hoping it would change, but it never did. There was a vulnerability to her that I hadn't seen before, something raw and real that made me realize I wasn't the only one trying to pick up the pieces. As we talked, I felt something shift in me for the first time in months, a sense of relaxation that I hadn't felt in so long. And for the first time since everything had collapsed, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward after all this. Maybe trust, connection, and even happiness weren't impossible. I'd learned so much from everything that had happened. Lessons I never wanted to learn, but lessons all the same. I realized how much of my life I'd spent trying to be what others needed, instead of figuring out what I needed for myself. But not anymore. I wasn't going to live like that again. A few nights later, I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the sunset over the city. I pulled out my phone and sent Clara a message. "I hope you're happy," I wrote, my thumb hovering over the send button before I tapped it. A few minutes later, her reply came through. "You too." I put the phone down, leaning back in my chair, letting the cool evening air wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't weighed down by the past. What was done. It didn't matter anymore. The sky stretched out in vibrant oranges and pinks, the last rays of the day slipping beneath the horizon. And as I sat there, breathing in the night air, I realized something that had escaped me for far too long. Life was beginning anew. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace.